We live in a culture and in a society that routinely assigns the written word great importance. Technology has only increased the weight we assign the word because of the ease in which the spoken word is digitally recorded. What once required a chisel and a block or a quill and paper, today is no longer dependent on such primitive ways of recording. Perhaps that's an improvement, or perhaps a step back. It is much too early to tell. Regardless, the written word retains its place of privilege, and we understand that it's important, even if we do not always recognize or fully appreciate the ramifications. In illustration of the perceived importance of the written word, ask yourself how often you have heard the saying, "Words have meaning and have consequences." Your answer will be perhaps surprising. Recall the infamous, "It all depends on what the meaning of the word is," from the not-so-distant past as a useful illustration. The entire political career of a prominent politician was dependent on this one word, or so it was proposed. Not the first time in politics that everything was dependent on one interpretation, but certainly memorable nonetheless. As important as the written word is to each of us, it was not always the case. Before the invention of the printing press, when the written word was not easily accessible by most people, other forms of communication were much more important and necessary. There were some exceptions to this generalized summary. For example, in the formation of the Christian creedal formulas. Who can forget the original meaning and consequence of the statement, "Not one iota of a difference"? But for the most part, the generalization is valid. Before the written word achieved the prominence it has enjoyed for the last centuries, the spoken word was most important. "A man's word is his bond" was an oft-repeated mantra. Or as the scripture references, "Say yes when you mean yes, say no when you mean no." Other forms of oral communication were also preeminent and important. Myth, story, parable, and just a plain old good yarn was essential to culture and society. The ability to share a story, repeat what you heard, and pass it on to others was a skill that was highly treasured and held in esteem. All of this illustrates an essential point to understand when we're trying to appreciate how human beings communicate. A single word, written or spoken, has a well-defined meaning. A story, myth, or parable, on the other hand, is very much open to interpretation and is dependent on the images that it generates to be appreciated and useful. There is nothing worse than a story that loses its ability to convey feelings or emotions and other powerful images that encourage the understanding of what it is that is communicated. On the other hand, when the story is shared and the people who are listening are attentive, there is perhaps nothing that is potentially more powerful. The written word is powerful, but words can also be manipulated. Listen to the preacher who quotes from one part of Scripture, references another part of Scripture, moves on to a third reference, and then confidently proclaims the word of the Lord. It may be true that the referenced word appears again and again, but it seldom, if ever, has the same meaning in each reference. The content and the context is most important and necessary. In point of fact, a skilled manipulator of the written word can make the word teach any point that the preacher prefers. An image, on the other hand, cannot be easily manipulated. After all, as the saying goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. It is intended to be interpreted and reflected on. That's not to say that the image that is used cannot be deliberately manipulated. A change in the verbal tone by the person who is communicating the image can make all the difference in the world to the understanding of the person who is listening. This also comes into play when the story or the myth or the parable is translated from the original language into another language. The interpreted meaning of the words used in translation is important. This was the challenge and the problem when the text of the Bible was first translated from the ancient Greek or Latin text. It was such a challenge, with huge consequences, that those in power and with authority either resisted the entire effort in translation, arguably the Roman Catholic position for a period of time, or the translated text identified as the King James Version of the Bible, which provided the official approval. The blood that was spilled and the struggle that it represented in this task of translation fills the annals of both kings and popes. All of this is at best preamble to the main point. As Catholics, we are partakers of the Word. We celebrate the Word. We listen to the Word. We act on the Word. Since the Word is so powerful, and the words that are used to provide the image are so powerful, it would seem to suggest that there's a certain responsibility that is essential for the person who presents the Word, in particular if they claim a Catholic understanding and perspective. Does it not make sense to assume that there must be some kind of responsibility that necessarily accompanies this power? Those who wield the power of words seemingly have responsibility, both as an individual and as a member of the human family, to think of the ramifications of the words that they wield. A fair assumption, perhaps, but misplaced and not accurate. Unfortunately, this is not always the case, and the consumer of the word needs to be prepared and aware. It is all the more critical and important for people who may be in the habit of trolling the internet in search of clarity to a perceived religious question. The sad truth is that there is much more peril than there is satisfaction and help. Far too often, unless a person is very careful, it is possible to fall victim to the theological battles that permeate the internet. It's far too easy to fall prey to the false belief that you've discovered the truth, when in fact you may have been manipulated into believing something that's not truthful. The result of this kind of manipulated experience is nothing less than increased anxiety and confusion. Unfortunately, unlike the movie rating system, there is no reputable guide to the content and theological perspective offered by dueling influencers. Generally, and as a discerned choice, it is best to approach all social media content with a careful and a discerning attitude. It is essential that the person who is offering the commentary is in fact the theologian, or the Reverend Mother, or the Catholic apologist, or the so-called moral theologian that they claim to be. If they truly hold their credentials that they claim to possess, their organization, and for those whom they claim ordination in the religious profession, will be listed in the official Catholic directory, which is a resource that you can easily consult online. If there is no certification that can be authenticated, this should serve as a warning to those who are trying to discern and to learn. It's always been necessary, but today it's even more necessary to learn the skill of discernment. Discernment has always been championed within the Church, particularly for those who are engaged in a spiritual quest or journey, in order to receive the confirmation and act in the confidence of what is understood and accepted as a call, an invitation, or a particular grace received in response to the perceived will of God. We should not be afraid to enter into difficult or challenging discernment as a way of living. It is all the more a necessary skill and practice in a world where the Word is presented in so many different ways, some of which are deliberately misinformed and manipulative. None of us want to be a casualty of misinformation or just one more trophy in the theological battles that are raging around us.